Hi, everyone. Today we're going to continue with D3, and we're going to look at some very helpful functions in D3, such as scales and axes. So scales are something that you would want to transform a range of input values into a range of output values. For example, you can use scales to scale the size of a circle based on the data value. And if you don't use scales, then some things can blow up pretty easily. For example, if you use a linear scale and just map all the data value directly to height, then you can imagine when your value is very large, then the height of the bar, for example, will become too big to draw. So the good news is that D3 has a lot of types of built-in scales. And in this video, I'm going to cover only two of them, linear scales and ordinal scale. So linear scales define the mapping between a range of input values we call domain to a range of output values we call range. Here at the top, the domain function takes in an array specified by the lower bound, min, and the upper bound max. And similarly, for range, which is the output, we use a input values of min out for the lower bound and a max out for the upper bound. And below, you see how we're going to use that scale that we just defined. So here, we're trying to specify the x-coordinate based on the scaled value of the size from the data point. But how do you figure out the min and max for the domain? So remember that D3 is a really powerful for loop with a ton of useful helper functions. So that means we already have functions that can do those for you. Specifically, we have functions like d3.min, which takes in an array of numbers and then return the minimum value. And similarly, .max, .extend, they will return the maximum value and also the range, the lower bound and the upper bound. So here's an example of how to use that in practice. Here, in this example, we have an array of numbers as input, which is at the top. And then at the bottom, there you see we use d3.max and take in that array as input. And that will give you the maximum value for that array, and which you can pass into the .domain function. So here, the input is an array of number. But if the numbers that you want to scale is actually part of an object, then what do? So the good news is that D3 allows you to use something called an accessor to extract the number that you want from an object. So here in this example, data.map is the accessor. So specifically, we're pulling out the age value from an object. So here's how to put everything together. So at the top here, max age is the maximum values returned by the accessor function data.map. And then we use the max age below and put it into the domain. For ordinal scales, D3 has built-in color scales, such as category 10. For example, it gives you 10 colors. Category 20, it gives you 20 colors. And also there are variations like 20B, 20C, and so on. So D3, in fact, doesn't really care so much about what you pass into an ordinal scale. And the only requirement is that the domain is discrete. So that means you can pass in data that are actually ordinal, so meaning the ordering is meaningful, as in like-car scale, where you have discrete values like neutral, dislike, and so on. Or the data can also be categorical, such as a blood type like A, AB, B, O, and so on. So what that really means is that you shouldn't just use the color just because they are provided. You should think really carefully about whether your data is ordinal or categorical. So if it's categorical, then it's fine to use all the color scale directly. But if it is ordinal, then you don't really want to use a rainbow palette, for example. So here's an example of how to use the categorical scale in practice. So here, the input is an array of 3 animal objects. And each has a type. So we have like bird, rodent, and so on. And in the color scale, each color has an index. For example, we are using category 10. So that means the color for blue is index number 1. Color for orange is index number 2. So when you use this color scale as in the middle, then there you see that we're passing in the type of the object into the color scale. So that means what you get is at the bottom, right, where bird is assigned the color of blue, rodent the color orange, and so on. So besides scales, which transform data, D3 also has visual helper functions, such as axes. And similar to scales axes is also very easy to use. Here we're showing you an example where you are using the axis specifying the scale first, and then we'll specify the orientation. Here we're saying we want the orientation to be in the left. You can also similarly specify to right, top, bottom, and so on. And also you can specify something like tick marks. How many tick marks do you want? Default is 10, and here we're using 6. So in this video, we'll look at how to use some of the important D3 functions, such as scales and axes.